All right, let's get started. It's 4:30.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Welcome everyone back for another round of virtual Apres. Thank you for taking the time out of what is probably where I can see all these little windows peeking through, if you haven't shaded, a sunny day and joining us. Let's see. So today, just a couple of business pieces. So next week, we'll be covering a section on active learning. That's in page 32 of your Teaching Snow Sports manual. We'll be taking a deeper dive into that, kind of beyond what we talked about with Katie. If you want to go back and listen to that session, that's the June 26th interview. Then we're also going to have Eric Lipton on the show as our guest on July 24th. And let's move forward. Our quote for today is, "Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change." And that's from Brene Brown. Right? Without further ado, I want to welcome Nick Alfieri. Nick, give us a wave so everyone can see which square you are.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Heck yeah. All right, I want to introduce you just really quickly here. Nick is super passionate about psychology and knowledge acquisition. I do feel like I'm projecting Jonathan Blue when I use that term. Early in his snow sports career, he noticed that people just wanted to nerd out on tech talk, which I have to say that is a huge personal experience for me as well. And Nick really wanted to talk more about the humaning experience and the emotional experience, and like how that translates into a better on-snow experience for the student. He currently is on the PSIA AASI national team. He's on the snowboard team specifically. He is a Rocky Mountain snowboard and freestyle examiner and is on the snowboard committee. He's currently based out of Keystone Resort in Colorado. Past season, you could have found him at Breckenridge. I was hoping to see him in the future, run into him when I head out to Breckenridge, but I think we'll just have to have distant high fives. And in past seasons, Nick, you can shake me if I'm off here, you've spent your summers in New Zealand, where you've worked as an instructor, trainer, and examiner for, I'm going to guess what this stands for. It's SEINZ, Snowboard International New Zealand, Snowboard Instructors.
Yeah, Snowboard Instructors of New Zealand. Nailed it, yeah.
Off to a good start. And he is also serving on the National People Skills Task Force. Awesome. So today I want to continue the conversation, really quite poignantly from where we've been working up to this point, and move into this topic of what the value of validation is. Sorry, vulnerability. Thank you for that, Katie. The value of vulnerability, all right? Nick, I'd love for you to dive into this topic. And my hope is that we can get to a place of like, how does vulnerability create value for us?
Yeah, okay, so I think, that quote you said from Brene Brown is such a great quote to start, and all the benefits that vulnerability has. And being vulnerable is really, really tough. We know how tough it is in situations where we're with people we love and we trust. And sometimes being vulnerable can be in that. And we work in these environments where we're with people we've often met for the first time that day, or we're just work associates. And being vulnerable is really hard to do. It's a really difficult thing to make yourself do. And, emotional skills, things like that, like vulnerability is such a huge piece of what it takes to build relationships. Like when you're vulnerable, a lot of times you often see people actually, you're worried that people are going to move away from you. Like, oh, they just shared this really deep vulnerable thing, or even if it's a small vulnerable thing, you're worried people are going to move away from you. But what oftentimes happens is people move towards you, and you build relationships so much better when you're willing to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is that ability to be vulnerable is something you can practice all the time. Like I see it's a thing that when we go out in clinics, instructors, sometimes they only want to speak up, or they only want to say things when they know they're correct. And you lose so much information. You lose so much learning experience when you're not willing to be vulnerable and say the wrong thing. You know, that's really when you learn something. And so it's so easy to get in these group atmospheres and just kind of stop wanting to be vulnerable. And you get so insecure and nervous about what other people are going to think of you because you're worried they're going to push you out. But in fact, when you are vulnerable, they move towards you more often than not.
Nick, I'd love if you could take some of that and apply it to what might look like a real life example. So take us on snow, take us into a snowboard lesson, and maybe dip into this idea of like maybe what a difference between like a hit or a miss is.
Yeah, sure. With vulnerability, like an easy on snow example is when a student asks an instructor, and you see this a lot with newer instructors, ask the instructor a question about how to do something, what's the right way to do something, and the instructor doesn't actually know. And that instructor is really concerned that I'm an instructor, I have to have all the answers. I can tell you, I've been teaching snowboarding for a long time, and there's lots of answers I don't know still. And people will ask me things, I go, I'm not sure. And a hit would be in that situation to say, you know what, I'm not sure. Here's maybe some ways we could do it. Here's what I think might happen, some ways we could go about it. Let's figure it out together, and let's try these things out, right? That is going to give the student more investment into the lesson because they feel like they're part of this going through. And B, it's going to help you learn something along the way as well, because you're going to get to experiment and play with a couple different things with your student. The miss in that scenario would be, it's supposed to be done this way. And then you're like, I think that's the way it's supposed to be done. And maybe the student's having a really difficult time, but they think they have to listen to you because you're the instructor and you said to do it this way. So now you're actually hurting that student's learning. And it just turns into this massive snowball effect that can be really, really hard to come back from. And if you're not willing to be vulnerable right kind of from the start, if you don't know something, it's going to be difficult to recover from that.
Nice. Nick, I'm hearing some like semblance from some of our structured trainings for like children's specialists and probably level 1-2 cross disciplines. And that like, I really see the difference between like command and discovery, but also taking discovery a little bit further and saying discovery without an intended outcome, but being as it follows through the emotional development or the emotional comfort of the student, but kind of taking on a little bit more as the educator, and so and let yourself also share and lead by example of like, hey, like if I show that I don't know everything, maybe my student will have a little bit more freedom to speak up and say, hey, I don't get it.
Exactly. And you see it in clinics. Like another hit and a miss for this example is when you're a clinic attendee and your clinic leader asks you a question about whether or not you know something, whether you've heard about something, whether you're familiar with this specific, whether it's a model or a theory or whatever it is, and everyone's quiet and it's crickets in the group because no one wants to say no. And so that's a miss if you're in a clinic. Like I always encourage people to be selfish in a clinic. And what I mean by being selfish is, hey, this is here for you. This is you. Like you have to come and you have to put some effort in here. And I want you to ask the questions to learn the way you need to learn. Like I'm going to do my best to ask you questions and figure out how you like information delivered. But there's a two-way street, and some of this responsibility is on you if you want the most you can get out of this. And that unwillingness to be vulnerable sometimes really gets in people's way. And I bet we all know someone in our locker room who's like serial unwilling to be vulnerable all the time, and they're just stuck in the same rut, whether it's at certification or the same problem they're having with their teaching, and they're just not willing to be vulnerable. And it's such a shame. It's such a shame.
I hear you. I feel like this is also quickly coming back to pieces that we've talked about in the past shows about the difference between prescriptive and adaptive people skills. You know, being able to lift the goggles up. You know, we tell our first year instructors, like, do zip up your coat, put your goggles up, you know, and smile and look them in the eyes, right? Like, just to get you through those first days. And then as we adapt to be able to respond to the needs or the emotional needs of our student, now we're talking about what this looks like. And I think you're honing in on the clinic experience is so important. And I know many of the people here are trainers and clinicians themselves, and value the opportunity to see, to hear language put to that experience. So that experience of what does it look like to not always have the answer, especially when we've come from an environment but where that's what's been expected. And that's what we've been shown.
Yeah, it's really funny you bring this up, because I was just cleaning out my car and I came across an old 32 Degrees that had an article in it that I had written years ago, and that was all about getting the most out of your clinic experience, how to get the most, regardless of who your trainer is. Like, what are some things you can show up to a clinic with? And one of the main points was, the title of it was Let Go of Your Ego. When you walk into that clinic, you got to drop that thing on the floor, you know, and when I say ego, I'm not talking about, don't be confident in yourself and, you know, feel good about what you're doing. But that ego gets in the way of being vulnerable. And that is just such a huge mistake. And that ego comes out in a lot of tricky ways that maybe people listening right now are like, well, I do drop my ego. You know, I encourage you, take a look, because the ego plays a lot more than maybe we know in how we learn and in a clinic setting. And it can be so difficult, especially for someone who might be uncomfortable in a group setting, to then add, okay, I'm going to go out and be intentionally vulnerable today. But that's what it takes. And like that is people skills. People skills are practice. Like, you can practice your people skills just like you can practice a hard skill. And we're slowly getting away from this. Like, either you got the gift of the gab or you don't. You know, you're either born with it or you're not. And that's not the case whatsoever. Just like you go out and you practice on initiating your turn in a specific way, and you try it this way, and then you try it this way, you try it this way, you reflect on that experience. Going into a clinic setting, going into a lesson and saying, here's how I'm going to work. I'm going to try to be vulnerable 2 times in this lesson. If what you're working on is vulnerability, maybe you're working on something else within people skills or something else within relationship building that might be important to you. But you go, and then after that lesson's over, you reflect on it. Just like when you get done with those turns at the end of the day, go, wow, what did I do well today? What did I not do well? What do I need to work on? You reflect on it, and you grow your people skills in an exponential route when you begin to realize you have ownership, or you can take ownership, and you can take full responsibility for getting better at it.
Nice. There's so much value. Something that is showing up when you're talking about this is, and you touch on it lightly, and I'd love for you to expand a little bit, is like actually working your ability to apply people skills with a mindset that is parallel to applying technical skills. So something, you know, so please, if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, it comes down to just like anything else, you got to figure out how you like to learn. You know, I think one of the biggest tools for anyone in learning is reflection. Like, a lot of people will just go out and say, well, I'm just going to train today. And then once I'm done training, I'm done. And not that there's not value to stepping away and not always thinking about whatever you're training, but you have to reflect on that experience after it's over. And you have to come up with, something you did well, an area for improvement, something you did not do well on, that's really key. And that's the same thing that creates good physical skills, whether it's, anyone from, Olympic half pipe riders to someone doing the Hahnenkampf or something. They reflect on their experiences. So much is about that reflection. And you can use that same tool with people skills. You can use the same tool with physical skill, as far as, hey, here's honing in and diving deep into one thing that you're trying to work on. So, oftentimes we might see people who they're like, yeah, I'm going to go practice today. And, oh, cool. What are you working on? And they're like, yeah, just making turns, just everything. It's like, okay, if you don't have that clear focus of, here's something I'm going to go practice specifically on, whether it's for one run, whether it's for 2 turns, it doesn't matter. You have to have somewhat of a clear focus to get a little bit of value out of it. You need to do the same with people skills. And so often we lump people skills into this, like, just work on people skills, and it just kind of gets labeled as relationship management. And it's so much more than that. We have the people skills fundamentals, which are all about building relationships based on trust. That's one thing. Like, can you parcel that out? Think about one thing you want to do better and how you build relationships based on trust, and then go out and practice that one thing. Then reflect on that one thing. We so often make the mistake of working on people skills as a whole. And we're like, we're just going to work out on it as a whole. And we know that in our skiing and our snowboarding, just going out without a specific outcome in mind, when you're really trying to learn something specific, especially at high levels of learning, you have to go out with an intention. And that intention is really key. And so you have to apply that same specific intention. You don't have to, but it is very helpful to apply that specific intention to your people skills, so you can get what you want out of it. It's so similar to how we train for a physical skill.
Yeah, so I hear you talking about being intentional and specificity. Can you offer an example of what something specific would be within people skills that someone could practice?
Yeah. So you're going to go out with this specificity of saying, I'm going to work on helping people manage their emotions and put them in a better emotional state to receive information and receive feedback. That's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to focus on the way I'm going to do that is how I'm going to frame and how I'm going to use positive words. I might have a tendency to be overly positive with someone when they do something like, yeah, that was great. And we all know when we come down and get to the bottom run, we're like, wow, that sucked. And our clinic leader's like, that was awesome. Yeah, great. Everybody high five. Like, you might have that tendency, and then that puts you in a really negative space to receive any more feedback, right? So you're going to say, hey, I might have this tendency to do that. So I'm going to work on managing people's emotions, putting them in a better emotional state where they're more of a middle line. Realistically, we don't want them too peaky and we don't want them too low. You need kind of that nice middle line. And how can I get that person there? I'm going to try to make all my feedback completely realistic and objective. That's what I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on that. Whenever I'm giving really specific feedback, it will always only be objective. And I'm going to see how that plays with people's emotional states.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I feel like that's a really great example of something that people can take away and really practice preseason. I mean, we don't necessarily need the snow to fly to be able to apply these things.
Yeah, true. Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd love to turn and just talk briefly here about empathy exhaustion. What does it look like? How do we work through it? And just kind of help cultivate that conversation. And get some feedback from you on that.
Yeah, when we talked before this, that was something I kind of brought up that I'm real passionate about, and I think is this place that we kind of refuse to look at as instructors, and we always say like, oh, isn't this so great? We have the best job in the world. Look at our office. Look at the view. And yes, we have an amazing job, but sometimes it's very difficult. And being out on the snow all day, leading a group of people, like leadership can be exhausting. You know, you get home at the end of the day and maybe your significant other asks you the question like, hey, what do you want to do for dinner? Like, I just don't want to make a decision about anything, you know? And that, you know, we can lump a lot of things like burnout into there, and empathy exhaustion comes into there. But I think the first point is that it's something we need to be aware of. And I think it's something we say, oh, you shouldn't be getting burned out or have empathy exhaustion because your job is so amazing. No, it's actually really, really difficult to do this job because we're in charge of people's emotions and making them have an experience, and that can be exhausting. So one, I think, is just opening up the conversation and not shaming people for being burnt out. Or having that, you know, saying, man, I'm having a hard time doing that today. Yeah. Some of the ways to battle that I found is continuing to get better at what you do. So a lot of times, burnout will happen when you feel like you've kind of plateaued. And so making sure you're always kind of moving the needle forward. And that's where that kind of, okay, what can I do? That's where reflection is really key, where if you're reflecting your day, what can I do better tomorrow? Can I continue to do good? That's really going to help with that. And then empathy exhaustion, you have to find time to refill your tank. I wish I had better words than like refill your tank, you know, make you priority number one. Like I wish I had better words, but I feel so strongly that that's true. Like you have to figure out how to recharge your batteries. And that doesn't look the same for everyone. For some people, that's going out with a bunch of friends after work and grabbing beer. And that's what recharges you. That's fine. For some people, it's sitting at home by themselves saying, okay, I just need some me time to get some fuel back in my tank. But really keeping a close eye on what you're feeling with that kind of emotional exhaustion at the end of the day, because so often we don't want to talk about it in the locker room. That's not something instructors talk about a lot. So you have to, I talk with new hires a lot about, this job is going to be tough. Make sure you take care of yourself.
Nick, can you offer some starters? Your imagery has a little bit of a pause.
Sorry, say that one more time. You cut out just briefly.
Perfect. Awesome. So could you talk a little bit about some starters that you might be able to offer? So if somebody is in the locker room and they do want to cultivate some conversation about self-care or thinking about yourself and make that a little bit more of the normal behavior within the school, what are some ways that that you could offer to start getting that hum moving?
I'm going to tie it right back to vulnerability. Like if you're having that vulnerability, and you can go up to someone who you have somewhat of a good relationship with in the locker room, say, hey, I'm really struggling with being engaged and driven to make my students succeed recently. I feel like I'm exhausted emotionally. I'm not invested in this product anymore. Have you ever experienced this? What are some things you find you do? You know, like ask for that advice from the instructors, especially when you're new. Just like you ask, hey, I can't get my people to do this turn. What are some tricks you use? You know, the people in the locker room who've been doing this for long enough, they developed tricks to stay invested, and going out, being vulnerable and seeking that information to start that conversation is key.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We have a question here I want to send to you. From Jerry Ann, thank you. Earlier you spoke about vulnerability, and I'm curious how you see humility versus vulnerability. As an instructor, I always thought I need to have humility, strength to admit I don't know all the answers, and I need to encourage students to be vulnerable, courage to take a risk. Am I close?
Yeah, I think that's great. Like when I think about humility, I think about humility. I really like the not believing you have all the answers, which is really, really great. But then the vulnerability in that example was coming more from the side of getting your students to be vulnerable, and that vulnerability, if you can share a vulnerability with your students, they're going to move a lot closer to you, you know. And like a simple one for me is, I'm scared of heights. I'm scared of heights. There's chairlifts I ride where I got my arm like laced around the back, you know, and I'm like kind of feeling nervous, you know, and just sharing that, you know, like, hey guys, do you mind if we put the bar down? I'm getting a little scared of heights. You know, if that's something you need and you share that little bit of a vulnerable moment, that's great. You know, I'm not saying go out of your way when your student shows up to be like, here's all the things wrong with me, you know, but when those opportunities arise, you know, take the opportunity to do that. But yes, humility and vulnerability are different. And I do know many people who I would say have humility, almost to the point where they don't want to tell anyone I have the answer, I know this, but then they're also can be scared to say they don't know something. Those two they're not exclusive, that if you have humility, you're also willing to be vulnerable. Some there's a mix of those that you can have. So I hope I answered that question. I feel like I got a little off topic.
I'm seeing some head nods and clapping. We even got some good emojis rolling here.
Oh, good.
That was awesome. So one of the things I'm hearing and connecting the dots from what you mentioned earlier is maybe some practice skills could be picking like one easy grab thing for yourself and using that as like your practice point when you do like greet a new group to start to become comfortable. Because I would guess that for a lot of us, it's practicing it enough that it's not always horribly uncomfortable. So
yeah.
Maybe you pick something simple like, hey, I don't like to speak in front of people, and this is actually really hard for me. Or it could be your example of heights, something that's kind of not too personal, but something that you can toss out. It's already in your back pocket. You've thought about it. You feel safe saying it, but it does have a possible pathway of opening up a two-way relationship.
Yeah. And the key, the real key is that, and it comes with time. Sometimes when you're trying to force yourself to learn something, especially with like a people skills thing, it can come off as being real disingenuous because you are trying to force yourself to do something sometimes. But the key is to be as genuine as you can all the time. So like with vulnerability specifically, and we could talk for hours on all kinds of different other topics, but you know, it's not just walk up to your group and be like, okay, I'm gonna say this thing which it makes me really nervous just because I want to express something that makes me vulnerable. There's a certain amount of you need to be really genuine when you're expressing it. And the more and more you become comfortable with expressing vulnerabilities, the more genuine, I guess maybe genuine isn't the perfect word in that scenario, but the more your body language is going to change. You're going to be more comfortable with it. You're going to be so much more open to authenticity. Great. You're going to be so much more authentic in that. And then that's gonna start to add to that connection that you build with those students and peers and friends and you know, even your bosses, your supervisors, your managers. That vulnerability can bring all those relationships together.
Awesome. Thank you for that. We just have like another minute or two left. I would love for you to talk about self-forgiveness and how that applies to people skills. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, etch a sketch brain. You're allowed to, after that point of reflection, once you've reflected on it and you've made a plan of, okay, I reflected on this, here's what was good, here's what was bad, here's how I'm going to move forward, here's how I'm going to change. You have to let that go. So some of the questions that I've developed with myself to practice self-forgiveness is ask myself, did I do the best I could in that moment? Did with the energy I had, did I do the best I could in that moment? Yes, in reflecting and understanding now that that person yelled at me afterwards, obviously it should have been, I could have done something better, but asking yourself, and if that answer is a yes, and hopefully most of the time people are doing the best they can, that's a huge catalyst to allow yourself to practice that forgiveness. We don't want to be that person. We all know that person who has so many insecurities and won't forgive themselves for anything, any mistake they've made. And it dampens every bit of learning you can do whenever all you're thinking about is the past mistakes. Mistakes are great. You have to learn from them. You need to reflect on them, and you need to make an actionable, realistic plan to move forward with them. But you have to forgive yourself for making that mistake. It's absolutely one of the most important things you can do, I think.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Remember, forgive yourself. We're all going to fail. And that's okay.
Being a human is so hard. It's so hard being a human, and you're never going to get it right all the time. And you just have to accept that. You have to. Yeah. Being a human is the worst sometimes.
Oh my gosh. Nick, I want to ask you a couple of off-topic questions.
Yep.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay. Describe an average moment for you that brings you joy.
Catching a fish out of a secluded river.
Awesome. What's a book that you're reading or have read recently?
Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell.
Awesome. Yes. The audio is really special on that one as well.
Yeah.
Let's see. What is your favorite snack?
Oh, my favorite snack is potato chips. Sea salt potato chips.
Yes. All right. What's a podcast you've loved and listened to recently?
A podcast I loved and listened to recently was a Joe Rogan experience where he had a fellow comedian on who I'm blanking on the name. Oh, Bill Burr. Sorry, it was Bill Burr. He had Bill Burr on, and it was really cool to me because Bill Burr has this real style of, like, he goes on rants in his comedy, and he's kind of this like gruff, tough guy. And by the end of the podcast, he was like sharing these like really intimate, vulnerable, like being like, man, like this coronavirus stuff made me realize how many things I have to personally work on. And I thought I was really good at this relationship stuff, but it turned out I'm not. And it was just really cool to me to hear that, and that stuck out in my mind.
Thank you for that. I have to check that out. Best and worst part of your job as a snow sports professional?
As a snow sports professional, the best part of my job is when I think this is for a lot of people, when you feel like you were a catalyst for someone getting somewhere that they might not have gotten without you, and you feel like that person achieves self-actualization in that moment. Whether we could argue about what self-actualization is for a long time, but what I would call self-actualization in that moment of achievement. And the worst part of the job is burnout and empathy exhaustion. And when it is so difficult to feel like you don't have the energy, and then you have to put on a face because these people are coming in it takes energy 10 times what it normally would when you might be dealing with some depression or something like that, to paint that smile on and force yourself. You feel like you're wearing clothes that don't fit, and that is the hardest part for me.
Awesome. Thank you. And then lastly, how can people reach you if they have follow-up questions?
If people want to reach me, probably the best way is going to be through my email, email address, and you can share it. I don't know if you can share it on the screen there as well, but it's NickAlfieri@gmail.com.
Awesome.
Reach out, and I'm happy to go either a phone call or whatever's best from there, but email is normally pretty pretty good way for me to communicate. I check it pretty regularly, and I'm pretty quick about getting back. So anything, just follow up with me there.
Awesome. Thanks. I can attest to that, Nick. Thank you so much. I'll make sure that his email address is posted in the show notes. You can go there. And remember, next week, June 17th, we'll be talking about active listening and expanding on what we learned with Katie. And Nick, thank you for your time and your expertise and spending time with us here. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.